One bad step on a wet rock, and your prehistoric weekend suddenly became extremely prehistoric. For you, a broken leg means doctors, x-rays, painkillers, and several disappointing weeks on the couch. For an ancient human, there was no ambulance, hospital, or cheerful nurse asking about insurance. Yet fossil skeletons show that many people survived fractures serious enough to reshape their bones permanently. So what actually happened when someone broke a bone thousands of years before modern medicine? First, ancient humans were not constantly falling apart like poorly assembled cave furniture. Falls, rock slides, hunting accidents, animal attacks, and human violence nevertheless made injuries a regular danger. A fractured finger was inconvenient, especially when nearly every daily task required strong and cooperative hands. A broken thigh bone was an entirely different problem, because walking could become impossible almost instantly. Unlike a small cut, a serious fracture could disable someone for weeks, months, or permanently. Pain would arrive immediately, apparently having invented express delivery long before humans invented the wheel. The body would then begin a complicated repair process without asking whether the timing was convenient. Blood vessels around the break would rupture, creating swelling and a protective clot around the injury. Specialized cells would remove damaged tissue, while new tissue gradually formed between the broken ends. Over the following weeks, a softer bridge called a callus could begin stabilizing the fracture. Eventually, that temporary structure might harden and remodel into strong bone over many additional months. Archaeologists can sometimes read this healing process because repaired bone preserves visible changes in its shape. A heavily remodeled fracture tells them that the injured person survived long after the original accident. A large, irregular callus may reveal that the bone healed, although perhaps with poor alignment. No healing around a fracture can mean the injury happened near death or after it. That distinction matters because skeletons are evidence, not prehistoric medical records with conveniently completed forms. But survival required much more than simply waiting for the body's repair crew to finish. The injured person still needed water, food, warmth, protection, and somewhere relatively safe to rest. If a leg was broken, reaching water could become a group project with terrible transportation options. If an arm was broken, making tools, preparing food, climbing, carrying, and hunting became harder. Even collecting firewood could transform from an ordinary chore into the Stone Age obstacle championships. Prehistoric communities therefore faced a practical question whenever someone suffered a major injury. Would helping this person improve the group's future, or place everyone else in greater danger? A closed fracture remained beneath the skin and could sometimes heal with enough stability and time. An open fracture exposed tissue through a wound, greatly increasing blood loss and infection risks. Without antibiotics or sterile surgery, that second kind could become deadly with frightening speed. The group could not identify bacteria, but they could certainly recognize bleeding, swelling, smell, and fever. They may have cleaned wounds with available water, although archaeology rarely preserves evidence of that action. They could also apply pressure to bleeding because the usefulness of pressure is extremely difficult to miss. The smartest immediate response was often the simplest one: stop moving the damaged body part. Humans probably learned through experience that constant movement made some injuries hurt more and heal worse. Anyone who has stubbed a toe has already completed the introductory course in this research method. Supporting the injured limb with wood, bark, hide, or fiber would have been technologically possible. However, technological possibility is not the same thing as direct archaeological proof of prehistoric splinting. Archaeologists rarely recover soft straps, wooden supports, medicinal plants, or the helpful person holding everything together. Those materials decay, leaving the skeleton to tell only the final chapter of the recovery. A well-aligned, healed fracture may suggest immobilization, but it cannot prove exactly how alignment was maintained. Misaligned healing, likewise, does not prove neglect because severe fractures can heal badly despite careful support. Some injuries allowed limited movement, especially when they affected ribs, fingers, toes, or smaller bones. A cracked rib could make breathing miserable while leaving its owner technically capable of walking. A broken femur could prevent travel entirely, and turn every nearby predator into an unwanted audience. The group therefore had to adjust its speed, route, food sharing, sleeping place, or daily workload. This was healthcare, even when it involved no specialist, medicine cabinet, or impressive ceremonial hat. It looked less like a hospital and more like everyone quietly accepting extra chores. And the bones suggest that, surprisingly often, somebody did accept them. The strongest clues come from ancient skeletons whose injuries healed long before their owners died. One famous example emerged from Shanidar Cave in the mountains of what is now northern Iraq. Archaeologists discovered several Neanderthals there, including an unusually injured individual called Shanidar I. He lived tens of thousands of years ago, when daily survival already demanded considerable physical ability. Injuries affected his face, right arm, leg, and foot, while abnormal ear growths probably damaged his hearing. At least one foot fracture healed, even though it likely contributed to an uncomfortable and noticeable limp. Despite these difficulties, Shanidar I survived until approximately 35 to 45 years of age. His bones prove that he lived through serious physical problems, but they preserve no eyewitness testimony. We cannot identify who helped him, what treatments they used, or how long each recovery lasted. Researchers also debate whether he required constant care or adapted more independently than traditionally assumed. Still, combined problems with movement, hearing, vision, and one arm would have created serious daily challenges. Receiving food, protection, or assistance during difficult periods therefore remains a reasonable interpretation. That does not mean Shanidar I spent his life lying beside the fire looking dramatically fragile. He may have made tools, prepared materials, watched children, shared knowledge, or performed other valuable tasks. Supporting him could have been cooperation between useful companions rather than one-directional prehistoric charity. Another Neanderthal, discovered at La Chapelle-aux-Saints in France, became known as the Old Man. His skeleton displayed extensive tooth loss, joint disease, and other conditions accumulated during a difficult life. Nevertheless, he survived long enough for his body to adapt to several chronic problems. Like Shanidar I, he demonstrates survival with impairment, although not a complete record of treatment. Archaeological interpretation becomes dangerous when one unusual skeleton is forced to explain an entire species. At Krapina in Croatia, other Neanderthal remains include fractures that healed during their owners' lives. One individual survived a broken collarbone, an injury that would have restricted painful upper body movement. Recovery probably required weeks of reduced activity while the bone slowly stabilized and repaired itself. It was not a glamorous survival story, but most healthcare is basically unglamorous inconvenience management. Across prehistoric populations, researchers have identified healed injuries affecting arms, legs, ribs, skulls, and hands. These patterns show that broken bones were neither automatically fatal nor unusually rare. Some fractures healed in poor positions, leaving shortened limbs, altered movement, or permanent discomfort. That outcome reveals both the body's impressive resilience and its occasional enthusiasm for imperfect construction. When a severe injury healed well, assistance becomes more plausible because stability greatly improves fracture recovery. Even then, a repaired bone cannot prove that someone delivered dinner with love and encouraging speeches. An even older discovery from Dmanisi, Georgia, does not involve a fracture, but strengthens the cooperation debate. The approximately 1.77 million-year-old individual had lost nearly every tooth well before death. Bone filled the empty tooth sockets, showing that this person survived for years after the losses. Soft foods, food processing, personal adaptation, assistance from companions, or some combination may explain that survival. Whatever the answer, living with major physical limitations appeared extremely early in the human story. Then, a discovery from Borneo pushed evidence for complex medical intervention in a remarkable direction. Approximately 31,000 years ago, someone deliberately removed the lower left leg of a young person. This was technically an amputation rather than a fracture, but it presented even greater survival challenges. The remaining bones remodeled cleanly, without skeletal signs of the uncontrolled infection expected after accidental crushing. Researchers concluded that the individual survived the operation for roughly another 6 to 9 years. Controlling bleeding during the procedure would have required skill, preparation, and a frighteningly steady pair of hands. Keeping the wound clean afterward would have demanded continued attention during a long and vulnerable recovery. The patient also lived in a rugged tropical environment where limited mobility was hardly a convenient lifestyle choice. We do not know the exact tools, pain control, plant treatments, or practical knowledge involved. Filling those gaps with an imaginary miracle herb would create a better fantasy story than documentary. What the skeleton confirms is that prehistoric people could perform a planned intervention and sustain its survivor. Organized medical care was therefore not waiting outside history for farming, cities, and paperwork to arrive. Direct archaeological examples of wooden fracture splints appear much later, including specimens from ancient Egypt. Their later preservation does not prove earlier people lacked splints, only that direct evidence remains missing. Together, these discoveries reveal a pattern of observation, adaptation, support, and occasionally astonishing technical ability. Broken bones never produced one universal outcome because every injury created a different problem. A small fracture might heal while its owner continued working, probably with impressive complaints. A shattered leg could immobilize someone, especially if broken ends moved out of alignment. An open fracture might kill through bleeding or infection, despite every effort by companions. Survival depended on wound severity, age, health, nutrition, weather, and luck. A fracture near camp differed greatly from one suffered during a long migration. Breaking an ankle beside water was unfortunate. Doing so miles away was catastrophic. We should not romanticize the past, because many injured people died when assistance failed. Carrying a disabled adult across rough country demanded energy a small group might lack. Remaining in place could also reduce access to food or expose everyone to changing weather. Each decision balanced one person's needs against dangers facing the entire group. When groups stayed, companions could gather food, maintain fire, provide water, and discourage predators. They could redistribute tasks so the patient rested without becoming completely separated from daily life. The injured person might still repair tools, process food, teach skills, or watch for danger. Prehistoric healthcare probably blended kindness, obligation, reciprocity, and practical problem-solving. Humans depended on food sharing, cooperative defense, and collective childcare before anyone broke a femur. Caring for injured companions extended social habits essential for group survival. That cooperation may have offered an evolutionary advantage by preserving experienced and productive group members. A temporarily disabled hunter could hunt again, assuming recovery received enough time and support. An older craftsperson might preserve techniques that took years of painful mistakes to master. Knowledge leaves no healing callus, so its value is much harder for archaeologists to measure. We also rarely know an injured person's exact social role, personality, status, or family relationships. Assuming every skeleton belonged to a heroic male hunter merely replaces missing evidence with familiar storytelling. Women, children, gatherers, toolmakers, caregivers, and older adults also faced injuries and contributed essential work. Every healed fracture represents an individual life, not a generic caveman receiving generic cave service. The first hours after a serious break likely determined whether that life had a future. Bleeding needed control, exposed tissue needed protection, and the damaged limb needed stability. During the following days, the patient required water, calories, warmth, rest, and monitoring for worsening illness. None of those actions required a hospital, but all required attention and useful experience. For smaller fractures, care may have lasted briefly before the injured person resumed modified duties. For a broken leg, dependency could continue for months, and permanent limitations might remain afterward. Recovery was less a single treatment than a long chain of ordinary decisions made correctly enough. Someone had to bring water today, protect the limb tomorrow, and repeat everything when enthusiasm disappeared. In other words, prehistoric rehabilitation probably included the original invention of asking whether it still hurt. Sometimes the bone healed straight, restoring much of the person's previous movement and strength. Sometimes it healed crooked, but crooked and alive remained an excellent result compared with the alternative. Some survivors likely adapted their walking, grip, workload, tools, or role for the rest of life. Those changes made disability part of community life rather than an automatic sentence of exclusion. The evidence does not turn every prehistoric group into a team of flawless medical superheroes. It does, however, challenge the old picture of ancient humans as disposable, indifferent brutes. The archaeological truth lies between sentimental fantasy and the idea that only the strongest survived. Human bodies supplied the biological repair process, while human relationships sometimes supplied the necessary conditions. If an ancient person broke a minor bone, modified work and time might be enough. If the fracture prevented walking, the group's schedule, movement, and food distribution could change dramatically. If bone pierced the skin, even determined care might fail against bleeding and infection. The outcome therefore ranged from temporary inconvenience to lifelong disability or death. But healed prehistoric fractures show that serious injury did not always remove someone from the story. Many survivors remained because their bodies repaired themselves and other people helped keep them alive. A broken bone tested more than one skeleton. It tested the flexibility of an entire community. Long before medicine had a name, cooperation was often the treatment that made every other treatment possible. Thanks for watching, and remember, long before hospitals existed, sometimes the most important medicine was another person willing to carry the water. In a world without doctors, survival often began with someone simply choosing not to leave you behind. If you found this video useful or interesting, please hit like and subscribe for more journeys into the surprisingly complicated lives of ancient humans. Your bones will not notice, but the channel definitely will. See you in the next journey.